Story number 1. The Music Room. The music room at Blackwood High was different from the rest of the school. While the rest of the building was modern, with bright lights and whitewashed walls, the music room was older, with dark wooden paneling and narrow, frosted windows. No one knew why it was never renovated, but every student knew the stories. They said that decades ago, a girl named Evelyn had died in that room during a piano recital. She'd been a prodigy, forced to practice for hours every day by her cruel teacher. One day, she collapsed at the piano, her head hitting the keys with a discordant crash. Some said she had a heart attack, others said it was something worse, but the music room always felt off, as if Evelyn never really left. Sophia had heard the stories but didn't believe them. She loved playing the piano and had been thrilled to learn that Blackwood High had one in its music room. She didn't care about the rumors, she just wanted a place to practice. One evening, after the school day had ended, Sophia stayed late. The halls were empty, and the building was quiet. As she let herself into the music room, the piano sat in the center of the room, gleaming despite its age. Its keys were yellowed, and its surface bore faint scratches, but it played beautifully. Sophia sat down and began to play. The first notes filled the room, rich and haunting. She played one of her favorite pieces, losing herself in the music. But as her fingers danced across the keys, she began to notice something strange. The piano sounded wrong. Some notes were sharper than they should have been, others deeper, almost like whispers. She paused, frowning, and played the same passage again. This time, the wrongness was unmistakable. The notes didn't match what she was playing. Instead, they formed a melody of their own, one she didn't recognize. She stopped and looked around, her heart racing. The room was empty, but the piano keys moved on their own. Sophia stumbled back, knocking over the bench. The piano continued to play, the melody growing faster and louder. It sounded like a waltz, but there was something eerie about it, something that made her skin crawl. The lights flickered, and a shadow appeared on the far wall. It was the silhouette of a girl, her head bowed as if she were crying. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "Evelyn," she whispered. The shadow didn't respond, but the piano stopped playing. The silence was worse than the music. Sophia edged toward the door, her pulse pounding in her ears. But before she could reach it, the door slammed shut. "Stay," a voice whispered. It was faint, almost like the rustle of leaves. Sophia turned back to the piano. Sitting at the bench was a girl about her age. Her long hair hung in front of her face and her hands hovered over the keys. Who are you?" Sophia stammered. The girl slowly turned her head, revealing a pale, sunken face with hollow eyes. "I just want to play," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. The girl's fingers moved across the keys, and the waltz resumed, faster and more discordant than before. Sophia covered her ears, but the sound seemed to seep into her mind, growing louder and louder until it was unbearable. "Please stop," she cried. The girl looked at her, tilting her head. "You don't like my music?" she asked. Sophia shook her head. "It's not that. It's just, you're scaring me." The girl's expression darkened. "They scared me too," she said. "They laughed at me. They pushed me too hard, and when I couldn't play anymore, they left me here." The lights flickered again, and the room grew colder. Sophia could see her breath as the girl stood, her form becoming less solid, more like smoke. "They made me play until I couldn't move," the girl whispered, "and now, so will you." Sophia felt a force pulling her toward the piano. She tried to resist, but her legs moved on their own. She sat at the bench, her hands resting on the keys. "Play," the girl commanded. Sophia's fingers began to move, playing the same haunting waltz. The music filled the room, louder and faster with each passing moment. Sophia's hands burned as if the keys were on fire, but she couldn't stop. Her vision blurred and her chest tightened. The girl watched her, a faint smile on her ghostly face. "This is your turn," she said, "and when you can't play anymore, you'll stay here, just like me." Sophia's mind raced. She had to do something, anything, to break the spell. Summoning all her strength, she slammed her hands down on the keys, creating a cacophony of sound. The waltz stopped. The ghost screamed, her form twisting and writhing like smoke caught in the wind. The lights exploded, plunging the room into darkness. When the silence returned, Sophia was alone. The door creaked open, and a faint breeze swept through the room. Sophia didn't wait. She grabbed her bag and ran, vowing never to enter the music room again. But as she passed by the frosted window, she heard a single haunting note from the piano, and she knew Evelyn wasn't done playing. Story number 2. The locker room. Nobody liked the old locker room under the gym. It hadn't been used in years, ever since the school built a newer one above ground. But students whispered about why it was abandoned. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed a student had gone missing down there decades ago, their body never found. But most just avoided it, not wanting to test the rumors. Except for Ian, Lucas, and Sarah. It started as a dare. They'd been talking after basketball practice, swapping stories about the school's so-called haunted places. Ian, ever the skeptic, rolled his eyes at the tales. "It's just an old locker room," he said. "Nothing down there but dust and cobwebs." Sarah smirked. "If you're so brave, why don't you prove it?" 10 minutes later, the three of them were standing outside the heavy steel door that led to the basement. The air was colder here, and the smell of mildew was strong. "Last chance to back out," Ian said, grinning at Sarah and Lucas. Sarah crossed her arms. "Let's go. Unless you're scared." Lucas, who had been quiet the whole time, shifted nervously. Maybe this isn't such a good idea. But Ian had already pushed the door open. The stairs creaked under their weight as they descended into the locker room. The light from their phones barely cut through the darkness, and the air grew colder with each step. When they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a long, narrow hallway lined with rusted lockers. The smell of damp concrete and decay was overwhelming. Ian waved his phone around, the light casting eerie shadows on the walls. "See? Nothing but old junk." But as they walked deeper, Sarah noticed something strange. The lockers were numbered, but the sequence was wrong. Locker 10 was followed by 13, then 17. The numbers weren't just out of order, they didn't make sense at all. "Guys," she whispered, "this place is weird." Ian laughed. "Weird how?" "It's just a locker room." But Lucas had stopped walking. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. They all froze, straining to listen. At first there was nothing, just the drip of water from somewhere in the distance. Then they heard it, a faint tapping sound like knuckles rapping against metal. Tap, 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 tap. It was coming from the lockers. Ian turned, shining his light down the hallway. Probably just a rat, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent. Tap, 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 tap. Suddenly, one of the locker doors creaked open. Sarah screamed, stumbling back. Lucas grabbed her arm, pulling her away. Ian, trying to act brave, stepped closer to the open locker. "Relax, it's just the air pressure or something." But when he looked inside, his grin vanished. The locker was empty, except for a pair of muddy shoes. The shoes were small, like they belonged to a child. "What the hell?" Ian muttered, reaching out to touch them. "Don't," Sarah snapped, her voice shaking. But it was too late. The moment Ian's fingers brushed the shoes, the locker door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The hallway lights flickered to life, dim and sputtering, casting the room in a sickly yellow glow. The lockers began to rattle, their doors shaking violently as if something inside was trying to get out. Lucas screamed, "We need to get out of here!" They turned to run, but the hallway seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly into the distance. "No, no, no!" Sarah cried. Behind them, the rattling stopped. The silence was worse. Then came the sound of footsteps. The three of them froze, turning slowly. At the far end of the hallway stood a figure. It was small, like a child, but its face was obscured by the flickering light. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and it twitched with every step it took toward them. "Who's there?" Ian shouted, his voice cracking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed at them. The lockers around them flew open, one by one, their doors slamming against the walls. Inside each locker was the same thing, a pair of muddy shoes, all pointing outward. "Run!" Lucas screamed, pulling Sarah by the arm. They sprinted down the hallway, the sound of slamming locker doors echoing behind them. Ian was right behind them, but when they reached the stairs, he stopped. "I dropped my phone!" he yelled. "Leave it!" Sarah shouted, but Ian turned back, running toward the spot where he'd dropped it. The lights flickered again, and for a moment, Ian was gone. Then they saw him, standing perfectly still in the middle of the hallway, his back to them. "Ian!" Sarah screamed. He didn't move. Lucas grabbed Sarah, trying to pull her up the stairs. "We have to go!" But Sarah broke free, running toward Ian. When she reached him, she grabbed his shoulder and turned him around. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, and in his hand he held a pair of muddy shoes. "They're here," he whispered, his voice hollow. Before Sarah could respond, Ian was yanked backward, disappearing into the darkness. Sarah and Lucas ran, their hearts pounding, the sound of footsteps chasing them up the stairs. When they burst through the steel door, they slammed it shut and collapsed against it, gasping for air. The hallway was silent, but when they looked at each other, they noticed something strange. Their shoes were gone, and in their place, their feet were covered in mud. Story number 3. The substitute teacher. At Brookhaven Middle School, the arrival of a substitute teacher was always cause for excitement, or dread, depending on who you asked. But when Ms. Holloway arrived to cover Mr. Carter's history class, the room fell silent. She wasn't like the other substitutes. Her voice was low and soft, barely above a whisper, and her pale skin seemed to glow faintly under the classroom's harsh fluorescent lights. Her jet black hair was tied into a tight bun, and her large, round glasses magnified her eyes, making them appear unnervingly wide. No one dared talk while she spoke. She didn't reprimand anyone. She didn't have to. Something about her presence made the air feel heavier, as though the very room was watching you. After Ms. Holloway's first day, strange things began happening. Megan, who always sat in the back row, claimed her desk moved on its own. She swore she felt it vibrate beneath her hands, but no one believed her. Alex, the class clown, tried to prank Ms. Holloway by hiding her eraser. When she caught him, she didn't yell. She just stared at him, her unnaturally wide eyes unblinking. The next day, Alex didn't come to school. When his friends asked around, his parents said he had come down with the flu, but rumors spread that he wasn't at home. Some kids said his parents had filed a missing person report. By the third day, the class was on edge. Ms. Holloway continued teaching as though nothing was wrong, her chalk scratching across the board in perfect mechanical strokes. "History is alive," she said at one point, turning to face the class. "Every action leaves a trace. Every choice echoes forever." Her gaze landed on Mia, who was doodling in her notebook instead of paying attention. "Mia," Ms. Holloway said, her voice impossibly soft. Mia froze. "Would you like to demonstrate how history repeats itself?" The entire class stared as Ms. Holloway approached Mia's desk. What do you mean?" Mia stammered. Ms. Holloway smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You'll see." That afternoon, Mia didn't show up for lunch. Her friends searched the hallways and checked the bathrooms, but there was no sign of her. When they asked the office about her, the secretary frowned. "Mia," she said, flipping through attendance records. "There's no student by that name in your class." The blood drained from their faces. "She was just here," one of her friends insisted. "We've been friends since the 3rd grade." The secretary gave them a strange look. "I think you're mistaken," she said firmly. By Friday, only half the class showed up for school. The rest had begged their parents to let them stay home, feigning illness or simply refusing to leave the house. Ms. Holloway didn't seem to notice or care. For those who remained, the day dragged on in unbearable silence. The clock ticked loudly, the hands moving slower than normal. Finally, as the last bell rang, Ms. Holloway addressed the class. "Thank you for your time this week," she said, gathering her things. "I'll see some of you again. Soon." She turned to leave, but just before stepping out of the room, she paused. "Oh," she added, "don't forget to check your history books over the weekend. Some of you may find your own names written there." The students rushed out, not daring to look back. Over the weekend, curiosity got the better of Liam, one of the few who had stayed for the entire week. He flipped open his history book, skimming the pages until something caught his eye. There, in the chapter on local legends, was a photo of Ms. Holloway. The caption read, "Ms. Edith Holloway, a teacher who vanished mysteriously in 1952, rumored to have cursed her final class before disappearing." Liam's heart raced as he flipped to the next page. It was filled with names. His own name was written at the bottom of the list, alongside the names of his classmates. The ink was fresh.